Welcome to the You at Your Best podcast. I'm your host, Morgan. Before we get into the episode, let me give a little bit of an introduction for anyone who's new. If you like listening to someone process life in real time, or you are neurodivergent, an overthinker, a perfectionist, or maybe feel things deeply, this is the podcast for you. This is a non-professional, very human podcast about choosing authenticity over performance. My goal is to remind you to always come back to yourself. I talk about very deep things. I don't avoid vulnerability, but I trust you to know what resonates, what feels safe, and what might be too much for you right now. And I also share a journal prompt at the end of every single episode to help you think. So join me if you want to create a life that actually feels like you, so that you can become you at your best. All right, let's go ahead and get into this week's episode. Hello, welcome back. I hope you're doing well. This week's episode is going to be part 2 to last week's episode. This week's episode is about what happens when the fear of being too much starts controlling the way you show up in your relationships or your friendships. This episode isn't about how to manage anxiety. It's more about something that I realized after recording last week's episode, that sometimes the fear of being too much actually changes the way we behave with people. And that's where I'm wanting to take this episode, coming at it from an approach of what is behind this fear and not necessarily what can I do to manage this fear. Just to give a little bit of a recap before I get into the episode, last week I talked about an experience with my boyfriend and our friend Dylan, where I felt like I was too much and I was annoying and I was in the way. I felt very bad about myself and really embarrassed about my behavior. I was so anxious that I was just like acting in ways that I normally don't act. I was needing constant reassurance, and it was a really weird feeling for me. And that episode was kind of like the realization that I have dropped a lot of my avoidant attachment behaviors, and I am now starting to notice and feel my anxious attachment behaviors more. So for me, what happened that day was actually a huge part of healing and a huge step in healing. And that was kind of like a hidden shift that I didn't really notice. And then the big insight of this week's episode is that you were never too much. But when fear takes over, whenever we start being scared that we are too much, we can sometimes start to act in ways that reflect that fear back to us. And I want to say something important here, because I think people hear conversations like this and immediately start feeling ashamed of themselves. Awareness is not the same thing as shame. Us noticing these behaviors doesn't make us toxic or manipulative or bad. It just means that we're becoming aware of how fear changes the way that we relate to the people in our lives. And honestly, that awareness is what allows healing to happen in the first place. So please don't listen to this episode with any shame. Please listen to this episode with self-compassion. So we start monitoring every single interaction. We start needing constant reassurance. We start over-explaining ourselves or spiraling over a small change in someone's tone. Sometimes we can find ourselves making our anxiety another person's responsibility and unintentionally abandoning ourselves whenever we're doing this. And that pressure is what other people react to. Not us being too much, not our emotions being too overwhelming, but pressure that they feel to have to hold on to our emotions and have this disproportionate responsibility over our behaviors instead of focusing on themselves. And I think what makes this so painful is that whenever we're in that state, it genuinely feels like we're reacting to reality and truth. It doesn't feel irrational in the moment. It feels real. It feels like people are pulling away from us or getting tired of us or secretly wishing we were easier to deal with. So then we start reacting to that fear before anything has even actually happened. For me, this shows up a lot of the time in like me replaying conversations over in my head and thinking back every single time to how people may have reacted to me and deciding in my head what their reaction meant about my value as a person. Sometimes like trying to fix misunderstandings immediately, like anxiously being so scared that someone thought I meant something that I didn't. And it's like I need certainty before I can calm down. And what's happening there is me trying to prevent abandonment before it happens and feeling hyper aware of other people's moods, and fear kind of creates urgency for me. Like my brain starts acting like every emotional moment is an emergency that has to be solved immediately, and not even in a shameful way, but in a very human way. And what all of this means is that people are not actually overwhelmed by our emotions nearly as often as they are overwhelmed by the panic we feel about our emotions. And whenever we stay connected to the original feeling, instead of spiraling into millions of meanings or thoughts about what the feeling says about us or what the feeling means, everything changes. And I know that sounds so simple, but it's honestly really hard whenever you've spent your entire life attaching meaning to every single emotion you feel, especially if you spent years trying to prevent rejection before it happens. So in these moments, it's really important to hold on to that original feeling and try not to spiral, try not to go down all of these fears that make it bigger than it is. Stop assigning big catastrophic meaning to the situation. Stop making the feeling proof that you are unlovable, because emotions are temporary experiences. But when we're anxious, we start turning emotions into identities. So instead of I feel insecure right now, it feels like I am fundamentally hard to love. Instead of I feel disconnected, it becomes everyone secretly hates me. And those are two completely different things. And let people be separate from your fear. It's really hard. It's so easy to mess up, and it's so easy to fall into this space of I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. And that's all your brain says. It's just constantly like, I'm not good enough. And I'm so scared that other people know that it's true, that other people start to see that, and other people start to notice that I'm not as good as they are. Or we start to think like, what if people start getting tired of me? What if people start worrying that I can't meet their standards? And we just like start spiraling into these thoughts instead of just sitting there with the original feeling. And that feels so unbearable sometimes, sitting with the original feeling without turning it into a story, because the original feeling is usually something really vulnerable. It's loneliness, insecurity, sadness, it's fear of rejection. And sometimes our brains would rather spiral than fully feel those emotions directly, because spiraling almost feels like more protective. It feels like if we think hard enough, maybe we can protect ourselves from getting hurt. And whenever we're doing this, we have to soothe ourselves and be present with what we feel, be present with the discomfort before seeking reassurance. And in these moments, also ask for connection instead of proof to the people in the situation. Instead of trying to get them to prove to you that you're good enough, just focus on genuine connection and say like, hey, I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed right now. And something else that I think I'm learning is that genuine connection actually requires us to feel uncertain. We cannot fully control how other people see us. We can't fully control whether someone misunderstands us. And that's terrifying whenever you grow up feeling emotionally unsafe in who you are. But real connection isn't built through perfectly managing other people's perceptions of you. It's built through honesty and presence and vulnerability, and allowing yourself to be seen without constantly trying to manage or change or control the outcome of the situation. This is a pretty short episode, but I want to end with some hope. Healing isn't becoming less emotional. As we heal, our emotions don't change. Healing is just learning how to stay connected to yourself without turning fear into an identity. I actually think healing is becoming more emotionally honest while also becoming more emotionally grounded. It's learning how to feel deeply without immediately turning those feelings into panic. And that takes practice. It's not something that we just suddenly know how to do. And a lot of the time, we can start to take emotions and turn them into stories about who we are or what other people think about us. That's very normal and very common, but it's very hurtful to our overall well-being, and it's a lot of the time not rooted in truth. So for this week's journal prompt, I want you to ask yourself, what emotions do I tend to turn into stories about myself or about other people or how other people perceive me? Okay, that's all for today. If something in this episode resonated, share it with a friend who needs a little reminder that they're not alone. If you want more conversations like these, be sure to follow and rate this podcast. Downloading this episode is one of the best ways to help this podcast grow, so be sure to do that. If you want to find me on social media, all of my links are in my link tree in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next Sunday.